In 2018, everybody knew that Jahan Dotson flipping from UCLA to Penn State was a big win for the Nittany Lions late in that cycle. Yet I don't think anybody expected Dotson to be one of the highest ranked players drafted from Penn State at the wide receiver position in the NFL draft. Second highest all time in the program, going 16th overall to the Washington Commanders this spring in the NFL draft. So the question is, how do the Nittany Lions replace him, and how does that play out in the receiver room? That's what we're breaking down today on the BWI Daily Edition as our season preview continues, taking a look at the wide receivers. BWI Daily Edition, getting you ready for the Penn State football season. I'm your host, Thomas Frank Carr, senior editor. Nate Bauer, once again, on residency here on the Daily Edition, giving us his thoughts and opinions, his insights into the program as we get you ready for Penn State football. Today, we're taking a look at the wide receivers. Nate, any opening thoughts or just how you doing? You get to pick what you want to respond to.
I'm great. How are you?
Doing good. It's that time of year. Like, I am now having to make decisions about what we talk about on the daily instead of there being a topic every day. There's a bunch of stuff we could get into. There's a bunch of different ways the show could go. I'm so excited that there's so much news because football is here. It's here.
Yep. Yeah. And it's fun. It's fun to, there are some other things going on in the larger, broader world of college football and specifically Penn State. And it's fun to talk about receivers catching footballs to get away from that a little bit.
Yeah, and of course, as our reporter on all things big picture, it's been something I'm sure you've been diving into the last couple of days as we get into Big Ten Media Days and, camp is just around the corner. So talking about football, I'll tell you, that's where I feel comfortable. That's where my wheelhouse is. So, Nate, when we talk about the receiver position, what's the headliner for you this fall coming into camp?
Yeah, I don't know if it's just me. It probably isn't. But Mitchell Tinsley, I think I tend to gloss over a little bit. Very obviously, he came in December, right? Or at least, made that commitment in December, got to Penn State's campus in January. And the immediate impression was all positive, right? I mean, everything about him, that he was consistent, that he brought something to the receiving game that Penn State desperately needed. He's an old head. He's been around for forever. Just having the ability to infuse your room with that, given the circumstances of losing a guy like Jahan Dotson, I just think that it created an atmosphere in which Penn State felt as though they weren't going to miss a step after Jahan Dotson left.
So I'll put it to you as you eloquently put the old head in the room that gives you that stability. This is what Penn State was working with before Mitchell Tinsley decided to join the Nittany Lions through the transfer portal. And if you checked out the season preview over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com, it is an On3 article. So if you want to join for $1, you get access to that article and then 12 months of goodies. As we get into all the stuff, you'll want to be a part of it. Join for $1. But that group had KeAndre Lambert-Smith with 1,000 career snaps, according to PFF. Parker Washington ahead of him by essentially a couple games with 1,200. No other player had more than 66. And that would be Malik Mega, who is a relative unknown. He has, one game under his belt. So adding Mitchell Tinsley and his 1,400, almost 1,500 career snaps, both at Western Kentucky. And of course, he has some JUCO experience. He's been around the block. So Penn State has 3 starting receivers that have a significant amount of experience. And let's get into those guys right now. Introduce you to those probable starters at the receiver position. Break this down because there's a lot of players in this particular group. These are the players that seem likely because of that. Parker Washington, as you mentioned, he's returning to the slot. Mitchell Tinsley is going to be one of those receivers on the outside, most likely, although he did play in the slot this spring. And of course, KeAndre Lambert-Smith is the third guy that we, right now peg as far as a starter heading into training camp, at least the guy that would be the guy that's at the top of the list in terms of a competition for snaps. So replacing Dotson is not a 1-for-1 thing, right?
Correct.
What is the makeup of this group? Do you expect one guy to be the lead receiver? And I guess the point is, what's the nature of a number one receiver? Is it a guy that the defense takes away, or the guy that the defense can't stop and gets all the targets?
Yeah, I mean, that's literally the crux of the argument. And what Penn State has to address this season is, are the players that Penn State has, okay, specifically in those three, are they good enough where no defense is going to want to commit the personnel to stop one, to take one completely out of the game, right? Because Jahan Dotson never was. For as good as he was, teams took an approach with him that, yes, they some of them attempted to take him out of the game, but he never really disappeared. He just consistently had production there. And so I think that if you're Penn State and you're saying, okay, well, maybe there isn't a star that will be the receiver of all of the resources that a defense has to try to take them out of the game. But in combination, they're the totality of what they all bring to the field says that, okay, even if one does get taken away, even if there is somebody that teams are going to focus on, let's say somebody gets hot, right? There a couple of games, rip them off, right? Mitchell Tinsley. And they say, okay, well, we're not going to let Mitchell Tinsley beat us. Are you feeling confident that approach by that defense opens up the door to let Parker Washington and KeAndre Lambert-Smith shine? And I think that the answer through all of this spring was yes, right? Like that they felt confident, that they feel confident as a whole, that those guys can all complement each other and all present kind of more of a triple threat than anything that they had either of the past 2 years, when it was literally just Dotson and Parker Washington.
Yeah. And Parker Washington in that particular situation is interesting, being a guy who plays primarily from the slot. 91% of his slot snaps came from the slot last season, according to PFF. So can you have a guy that is your number one receiver operating from that particular position? Because I think we saw the answer is kind of yes. It's a soft yes when you watched KJ Hamler do that, and he was the number one receiver. But that was a very inconsistent passing game for Penn State in 2019. That team was led by the ground attack, which, was the clear focus of the way the offense was gaining explosive plays and explosive yards, augmented by that particular situation. And that's where, when we talk about this, I know a lot of fans and a lot of media point to Washington first because he's the returning player in the team. And I think that's fair. But what is the nature of the position where Mitchell Tinsley got 1,400 yards and was a bona fide deep threat last year at Western Kentucky and has what seems to be a very complete game? I wonder if Washington is going to be the next guy up, or if there is going to be more of either an equal distribution, or Tinsley's just the guy because he's 6'1", 200 pounds, and plays on the outside and can flip into the slot, as we saw this spring, and has the versatility to play in there. So I think all those factors, we don't really know how that's going to play out yet.
Does Mike Yurcich want, because we've talked about this, and this is something that they've talked about last year, is, okay, 91% of those snaps for Parker Washington. Is that going to be the situation this year for him? Is that something that he wants? Is that something that Penn State as an offense wants? Because to me, what I've gathered explicitly or implicitly is that Penn State would like these receivers to be mostly interchangeable. They would like them to be able to exploit matchups, to be able to move around the field and feel comfortable wherever they are. And so, was that a matter of circumstances last year where Parker Washington was those 91% because he excelled in that role, or because they didn't want to take Jahan Dotson out of the spot that he was on the
Right.
field. And so
Right.
I don't necessarily know the answer to that question, but I think that if I had to make a guess right now, it's that you would see a little bit more interchangeability but between these guys, and especially given the fact that they have as much depth as they feel like they have in receivers 4, 5, and possibly even 6.
Yeah, I tend to have a hard time with that conversation as well, because we do hear that. And I had a long conversation and I wrote a whole article about how positionless receivers are now the trend. And at the same time, Penn
Yeah.
State definitely has defined positions for where they play guys eventually. Like, guys don't bounce all over. Some guys play with a little more interchangeability. And I think it's looking at Dotson, 23% of his snaps came from the slot, and he was productive in those snaps. So I think it's more about getting one guy maybe situationally in a good matchup that's maybe your number one receiver, versus having every single player be able to line up everywhere. And I don't know that an offense functions that way as easily, because you do have to define the role for the guy so he knows what's expected of him on a regular basis. So I struggle with that too, because the theory and what you'd like to do feels very different than what we see in practice. That being said, I don't think anyone else, Brenton Strange was the only player that truly was 50-50, of 50% of his snaps were in the slot, and then the rest were either in line or out wide. But you mentioned those other players. So let's take a look at the rest of the depth here, because this is the conversation heading into 2022, that it's not just those top 3 guys. The 3 on the list here, Malik Mega, Liam Clifford, and Harrison Wallace especially, are the guys that we are going to have a conversation about, and specifically Mega and Wallace as what we expect to be a competition for that 3rd receiver spot with KeAndre Lambert-Smith, who has struggled throughout his career with consistency. He has 0 contested catches, according to PFF, or last 2 seasons, and I believe 7 drops. So consistency has been his issue, playing big, being able to be that downfield threat, explosive player. He had 15 yards per reception last year, but just in and out when it comes to the ability to make those plays. How do you feel about the depth, I guess, not just behind Lambert-Smith, but in general, to push the offense, to raise that floor, to get that consistency we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think that I don't expect KeAndre Lambert-Smith to lose that battle in the preseason, but I do expect Malik Mega and Harrison Wallace. Those are really the 2 guys, right? That we can have an entirely separate conversation about who that 6th might be. I would include Jahan Dotson into that conversation, depending on how his kind of physical maturation continues or doesn't. But yeah, if Harrison Wallace and Malik Mega, each of whom it seems to me give you the opportunity to stretch the field a little bit, who give you the opportunity to, for lack of a better term, out jump.
Right?
Play
bigger.
They give you a size, right? They give you a size mismatch. I mean, I think that having those elements that you can bring to the field, the question is whether or not either one of those guys brings something that's more appealing and more consistent, being the operative term, than what KeAndre Lambert-Smith does. And again, that's something that I think is going to have to play itself out in the preseason. But the way that these things typically go is that there is a line of demarcation, right? Like, for as much as people might want to talk about playing 5 receivers or 6 receivers, you're still probably going to see 3 that, in terms of snap count, have a clear separation from the rest.
The bench shortens in crunch time, right? So in basketball, when you get to the playoffs, you might be only playing 6 guys because that's your best 6, versus throughout the course of the season, you might see a number of guys get in there and make some plays and do some things. But in crunch time, you might be back down to your 3 best receivers, and the rest of the offense, when it comes to receptions, plays a part in this as well. Which brings us to the other point I want to ask about the receiver position, and this is going to tie into something that we haven't talked about yet on the daily in our season preview, but the running back position. All this ties together. Jahan Dotson was the running game at certain points last year. And he was the deep passing game, and he was the intermediate passing game. That's how you get so many targets. That's how you get 137 targets. So if we're using last year as a template, is that an incorrect template to focus on and see there's not going to be maybe even as many passes as there were last year to then divvy up amongst more receivers?
I'm conflicted on that. And I just wrote the approach to the running backs, right? I did the same thing that you did for the receivers. And what becomes very clear is whether it's Mike Yurcich or James Franklin, both, I think, see the passing game as the road to success offensively.
Yeah.
And so it's not about, I don't see anything transformative in the sense of, they're going to go to 35 carries a game this season.
Right.
Like it's just, even if there are improvements in the running game, that's not what it's about. What it's about is turning the 15 to 20 carries that you're giving your running backs every game and having 2 or 3 of them hit for big runs, right? Touchdown carries, maybe more than 3, maybe it's 5, 7.
Yeah.
My point being, though, is I think they're still going to throw the ball quite a bit. I think that still is going to be the approach that you're going to see. They see that as not only the quick passing game, but just their receivers in general. They do see that as an extension of the running game. And that if you can deliver the football behind the line of scrimmage to a player in space, that's as good of an approach as handing it to your running back in the backfield after a second and a half, right?
Right. So if you want to give it the kind of the RPO sense, having a 6-on-6 in the box where you have maybe a tight end and 5 offensive linemen versus 4 defensive linemen and 2 linebackers, you have less of an opportunity there than if you have a 2-on-3 where you have a screen pass with 2 receivers. One of them maybe is a tight end, or last year Penn State had all 3 tight ends lined up on the boundary and basically made a new offensive line, then versus 2 defensive backs whose primary job is not run defense. So that's kind of the philosophy behind those things. But at the same time, Penn State got too far away, and this is where I'm going to push back on this. Penn State got a little too far away from having any sort of credible threat on the interior of the offense. If you're not ever running the football, really, with effect between the tackles, you can cheat wherever you want. You can deploy safeties somewhere other than the top of the box. So then those numbers are less effective when you can rally guys, and sometimes you can bait the offense into throwing screens when you're expecting it. So there were some times last year that Penn State, without that balance of having a threat on the interior of the offense in the middle of the field, you can start to soften the advantage on the perimeters. The second thing is going through some of the numbers with Sean Clifford, and this is how this ties into the receivers in my sense of, are there as many targets? I think he threw the ball 492 times last year. So if you take, he had 492 dropbacks, excuse me. He threw the ball 431 times. So if you take 100 off of that, he's still almost at 400 passing dropbacks. And that's only 7.6 a game. Like, we're talking about 7 or 8 plays where maybe the running back gets the ball instead of the quarterback keeping and throwing the football. And that's not a huge difference, but it would make a huge difference to the perception of this group that either there isn't a star or they weren't as good as Dotson because nobody or the aggregate didn't raise to that level. Yep. Anything else on the kind of the position group as a whole proper before we move on to some of the other parts of this group in terms of what the other makeups of some of the young players.
Yeah, I think that it is fairly clear to me what Penn State there isn't a lot of unknown in my mind. Yes, KeAndre Lambert-Smith is a little bit of a has he turned the corner of his development into becoming a consistent presence? I think that's a question. But the premise of Mitchell Tinsley and Parker Washington having to carry most of the load and being the primary targets, I think is more or less assured. It's just a matter of whether or not they can live up to that, right? As a pair, are they able to duplicate, even if it's not the, whatever it was for Jahan last year, 90 to 50-ish breakdown in terms of receptions, maybe it's 75-75, and that's okay. Right? Like maybe that's okay for those two guys to not rely so heavily on one and be able to more evenly distribute your passing attempts.
So the reliance on one particular player should be because of their dominance, not necessarily because the lack of other quality options, which I still think Parker Washington was a quality option last year, but to your point of like having a third and a fourth. So let's get into some of the other players on the roster. These, as always, will introduce you to the freshmen. Penn State has a 4-player class here in the class of 2022, headlined by Caden Saunders, a top 150 receiver out of Westerville, Ohio. Amari Evans from Texas, Tyler Johnson from Virginia, and Anthony Ivy from Millheim Township. Lots of speed here, Nate. Lots of speed and a lot of deep, explosive play potential. Any of those guys, when you're looking into, we talked about the conversation of who's that maybe fifth or sixth guy. Does Caden Saunders have the opportunity to factor in here as somebody who has the profile coming into this particular group of a guy who might be able to play early?
No.
Perfect. Let's move on.
I think that there are two likely candidates there who we could have a realistic conversation as to whether or not they'll be ready. One is Caden Saunders. The other is Amari Evans. Amari Evans has not played football long enough, or has not played the position, I should say, long enough for Penn State's stat. Because again, this is how this goes, right? It's not just about what the player represents. It's about how the staff feels about them. And the staff might love them, but also know that they're a year away. They are, whether it's physical or mental development, it's a bigger threshold to cross than simply saying, okay, well, this guy makes some spectacular catches during practice. That might be true. I think that both of those guys, there were, reports or, some intimations through the spring that those guys had opportunities and they had some eye-popping plays, but one play does not make a reliable option at this level of football. And Penn State will always go with who they think are more prepared for the play-in, play-out realities of the game.
So to back up for a second, Amari Evans played quarterback in high school, so he's making the transition to receiver, and he and Caden Saunders enrolled early. Those are the two guys Nate pointed out as two players who might be a part of the conversation because they were here in the spring and they have that both physical and mental advantage of being acclimatized to college football. Saunders is interesting because one of the things that I wanted to see from him in his evaluation was for him to get bigger and play more physical, because when he got the ball his senior year, he played a lot of option quarterback, and he didn't break a lot of tackles. So to me, that becomes about strength, lower body strength, explosiveness through contact. Not that he has to be a running back, but at that level, he should have been doing that. 160 pounds, he's now 178. So he has checked that box from a weight standpoint, but is he the consistency there from a playmaking standpoint as far as giving the offense more than just the yards that are there from the pass? That's, I think, what this offense looked for a lot last year in general, but that was kind of part of his profiles. He needed to play bigger through contact, and that means through the route as well. So his speed is very appealing. But if they don't need him and he's a slot only and Parker Washington's ahead of him, you know, do you want to burn his red shirt when you have the situation where you might not need him? And is he physically and mentally ready? So those are all the things where maybe late in the season we revisit that conversation. But I agree with you. As of now, I don't see any of those guys really being a factor early on. Although Caden Saunders is a very intriguing player as a special teams addition as well, where he might have some punt return ability. But again, those are all things that'll play out during training camp that we're keeping our eye on. So let's get to the next part of this, which is what are the X factors for this group, Nate? What are the things that are wild cards or things that you're starting with this year that you want to see from this group that could change the trajectory of Penn State's receiving corps?
To me, so much comes back to how frequently Jahan Dotson demonstrated his elite ball skills. I thought that was an undersold part of his game, and it works in multiple ways, right? Because we're talking about not just Jahan Dotson being excellent at catching what appear to be uncatchable balls, but also the quarterback who's delivering them, right? Is if Sean Clifford isn't particularly accurate while under duress, and you have a receiver who makes spectacular catches every time the ball enters the zip code.
Just some of the dopest catches I've ever seen.
Crazy.
From the most beautifully acrobatic things that you could ask a receiver to do. It was always fun watching him do that.
He was so good. It was an again, to me, and maybe it was just because I saw that transformation in him. I don't think that he had that at the beginning of his career. But he truly transformed himself through his Penn State career to where in 2020 and 2021 in particular, I just thought he made the spectacular look routine. Now, when we talk about an X factor, I thought that Parker Washington had a little bit of that, including a ridiculous catch, maybe two in the Outback Bowl, that bode well for him, right?
Yeah.
That bode well for that possibility of being able to make the clutch catch. I just having that consistency out of a player like Dotson. It's been a while since Penn State hasn't had what you feel like is a reliable receiving corps, right? Where it has, but I remember those days of routine catches that are just drops. They're just, we talked about them, just a drop, like just not seeing the ball, not catching it. It used to happen. There was one season in particular. I don't want to say, I mean, maybe it was 2018. I can't remember off the top of my head, but you know, right. Where that was a big part of the conversation. And so can they avoid that? As a group, is Mitchell Tinsley that shorthanded? Is Parker Washington? And so that to me, that is a big part of the X factor of how this group will succeed or not this season.
So to me, the questions are things that we have not really talked about as far as these are problems coming into training camp. These have been very under the radar, but they're curious, and I want to know more. I just want to know that I'm wrong to focus on these things. They're about things that we can't know yet because we haven't talked to James Franklin in person about some of the things he mentioned in the spring. And I'll start with this one. Parker Washington finished the season last year at 207 pounds, and he's currently 215. Now, that makes him 20 pounds heavier than Devin Ford. What is the situation there? Is that good weight? Is he playing like a running back this year? Is he going to be a slot dynamo where he has the ability to take handoffs and be explosive in that way? Or, and this is pure speculation, so I want this to be clear. This is just observations, but it is kind of my deep-seated conspiracy theory. Parker Washington had a shoulder harness on last year. Now, some players play with that. They just play with that because of a previous injury that it's not, but it's kind of like a reinforcement. But he was also a non-contact participant in the spring. And we have this other information of he's consistently gained weight this offseason. So I just want that question answered before we get into the other projections about his abilities and his talents this year. And Penn State does not comment about injuries, but it is informative to know, has he been rehabbing all this offseason? Was the spring because of something different? Like, am I crazy here? The other thing is Mitchell Tinsley. James Franklin talked about how steady Eddie, right? And this is the conversation that he had about Mitchell Tinsley in the spring was he's this great receiver from a consistency and maturity standpoint. And it's going to be great for him to be in our program because he can see just how athletic everybody else is. Explosive was the word, right? Speed, vertical jump. Did he meet those goals? Did he reach those thresholds that Penn State expected of him and that they believed he could get to? Because I see it on film of a guy who is explosive, but is he going to reach that level of being what he came to Penn State for? Being a, potential first-round draft pick that he wants to be, I'm sure, priority this offseason for NFL teams because he is that big, that explosive, and that good of a receiver. Because if those things are true, that neither of those are problems, then Penn State, I think, is set up very well. If one or more of those things is actually a factor coming to the fall camp, we have to reassess this conversation.
We're not going to find out.
Right.
It's going to be a few weeks until we, really have a good sense of whether those things are true or not. And I would argue even further. It's going to take the first games until you really see what they have. And again, it's all interconnected. Where's Sean Clifford in this?
Yep.
Where's the offensive line in this? But where's Mike Yursich in this? And so until those things settle themselves, I buy the premise that this is a deeper, more well-rounded group.
Wait for it. We have something for that. Now we're getting to our final segment. Sorry, that's entirely. I should have hit this on time. We have our final segment here. Stock up, stock down. What are we thinking about what we just described for the Penn State receiving room? This group loses a superstar, but they seem to add depth. So stock up or stock down for the group. Now continue what you were saying, and I rudely interrupted you. I apologize. Neutral. All that for my graphic.
I know. I tend to think that we're glossing over, not us necessarily, but just at large, glossing over the loss of Jahan Dotson. I just thought he was really good, really good, and really consistent. And so even if you have a piece like Mitchell Tinsley that you bring into the fold, it's just there are subtle ways or not subtle ways, right? Like the spectacular catch that doesn't happen, and how that impacts the game, how that impacts the outcome of a game, how it continues to drive a possession that otherwise is a punt. All of those different things that he brought to the field, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how this group is going to be able to duplicate that. However, to the credit of the rest of the room, with natural progression, with some of the consistency that they were able to show through the spring, there is reason for optimism. You might not have a first-round draft pick in your room, but if you have multiple draft picks, plural, in terms of mid to late rounds, that is still in some ways an upgrade over having one first-round spectacular pick. So we're going to find out. We're going to find out how that equation balances itself out or doesn't.
You are so correct in how the receivers have so very little to do with this. Because I talked about earlier, the perception of this room is going to be driven by things that are outside their control, from the running game to Sean Clifford. As you just pointed out, is Sean Clifford going to be the quarterback that distributes the ball to the guy that is open at all times, or is he going to pick a favorite? And I'm not saying that he picked a favorite last year. Jahan Dotson was the focal point of the offense. The court from scheme down to personality, everyone trusted Jahan. That's why he became who he was. But it's not like those things are entirely separate. So can Sean Clifford become a more well-rounded quarterback that, okay, I'm facing this coverage and I know where to go with the route, and it's not my lead route. It's not my number one receiver. I'm not going to lock on to that guy. I'm going to get to my progressions, and I'm going to get to my second option or my third option. And some of that might be the tight ends as well. So this group could be better, but the way it works out is perception is reality. The tight ends were not as good last year because they didn't have one guy leading the charge as the receiving tight end. The receivers, that might be their fate this year as well. So any closing thoughts here on the receivers?
No, I think we covered it. I just, Mitchell Tinsley obviously is a guy who I am anxious to see in full effect, right? It was a little bit like Arnold Ebiketie last year. You knew through the spring, you had every sense of what they brought to the table there. We had a couple of opportunities last year with the modified blue-white game. We had this year's blue-white game. I think what did Tinsley have? 5 catches in the blue-white game?
Oh, I've never, ever looked at the official stats of that. Not once.
And that's the point is it wasn't a real blue-white game, and it doesn't matter. It's just, it's just not an avenue from which you can gauge an expected impact. And so if you're us, you're relying on the feedback of people who know and people who have been around it and people who have a sense of these things. And whether that's internal at Penn State or whether it's external, right? A Jim Nagy, guy who I caught up with from the Senior Bowl, when the Senior Bowl executive director and head scout is talking about how much he expects Mitchell Tinsley to boost Penn State's receivers room. That says something to me. That registers as being important. And so, if he can deliver it, if he's as consistent as expected, if Parker Washington delivers, and then if any of those other 3 guys, KeAndre Lambert-Smith in the lead, but also Malik Mega, who has the potential to be kind of a breakout, Trey Wallace, if all of those go right, and even if they don't, and I think that is one of the keys here, is even if they don't all hit, you should still be able to find 3 out of those 5 who you feel very, very good about.
If we were going to dive right into the running backs and do our season preview of them, that would be the perfect segue. But we're going to save that for later. That'll do it today for the BWI Daily Edition, our season preview with the receivers. I do believe running backs are up next, so stay tuned. Make sure you subscribe to the Blue White Illustrated YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts. We're getting you ready for football season. Things are about to start popping.